Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Aaron Phillip, and I'll be your host for today's event. The arrival of summer denotes the activation of our key climate drivers. We refer to the large scale circulation patterns controlled by the sea surface temperature and atmospheric circulation. In today's webinar, we try to look ahead and interpret the summer forecast and important climate drivers are put into perspective for us to enable better decision making. This webinar is brought to you by the Northern Australian Climate Program, NACP, and DPI under the Grazing Futures and Leading Sheep projects. Now, before we start, I'll do a quick round of introductions. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Aaron Phillip, and I work for the Department of Primary Industries, and I am based in Charleville. Our presenter today is John McLaughlin from the NACP. John is the Climate Project Officer or Climate Mate for the Charleville region. John has been delivering this series of webinars for Charleville since 2022 and have gotten excellent feedback. We are looking forward to hearing from John again this afternoon. Welcome, John. In the background, we have Nicole from the Charleville DPI team, and she's helping with the delivery of today's webinar. Now, I'm sure many of you would have attended a webinar recently. However, just in case, I will run through the technology we are using today. It is fairly straightforward to use. You can interact with us today by typing questions in the Q&A tab that is present at the top left of your screen. If you do have any questions, please enter them into the question box at any time during the webinar. We will have a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation where John will answer your questions. We ask that you ensure your questions are clear so we can provide you with a specific and targeted answer. We may be unable to answer every question today, but we will try our best. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Leading Sheep webpage and YouTube channel. The link will be shared shortly with you as soon as we have processed the recording. After today's session, I will be sending out an email to each attendee that contains a link to a feedback form. It is very important to me and my team to receive your feedback as it helps us to improve our webinars and ensures the content of these sessions are the information you need. Alternatively, if you wish to complete the feedback directly after the webinar has finished, the link will be made available to you in the chat box and the QR code in the presentation deck. It is really short and will only take 2 or 3 minutes to complete. Your time is very much appreciated. Now, it's a hot afternoon here in Charleville, John. How is it where you are?
Morning, mate, or lunch time now, so good afternoon. It's definitely starting to warm up here, which is nice because in Toowoomba it can get very cold. So
Yes.
I appreciate the warmer weather.
Yep, I hear the weather's excellent right now in Toowoomba. And it's great to hear from you and good to know that we can hear you loud and clear. So over to you, John. Good luck.
Thank you, mate. And please do let me know if my connection gets a little bit poor, and I'll throw my camera off and focus on the slides. But for now, I'll leave that on. And thanks to all of you that have jumped onto this call, and to anyone that's listening to the recording of this over the next couple of days or weeks. For the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to look at the season ahead in terms of climate outlooks for southwest Queensland, particularly looking at our summer growing months, which are so important for our pasture growth in that part of the world. We're going to try to sift through all the noise of various climate forecasts and information that you might be getting, and really simplify it for any graziers out in that part of the world to help with their long-term decision making. And what we're trying to do is essentially with this sort of activity or initiative is to go beyond the old adage of working hard and praying for rain and move to something a little bit more deliberate, using all the tools at our disposal when it comes to climate forecasting and climate information. So just quickly, Aaron did mention NACP, who is the program under which I'm delivering this for you today. It's the Northern Australian Climate Program. It's jointly funded by MLA, the Queensland Government, and UniSQ. It's under the Drought and Climate Adaptation Program, and it's got research, development, and extension components. And there are 16 of our climate extension officers, also sometimes called climate mates, appointed across all of Northern Australia for different locations. I am the climate officer for Southwest Queensland. If you happen to be in a different location, I'm sure you'll get something out of this webinar itself, but feel free to get in touch if you're wanting to find out who is the more local climate mate for your area and see what information they might have for your particular location. Quickly, an update on who I am. My name's John McLaughlin. I work for a carbon company these days in my full-time role, but I have a few other roles within the industry, and my background is very much from the extension world, the NRM world up in North Queensland. But I've been doing this climate work on and off for about 7 years now, so I'm sort of well versed in presenting on this sort of information, and sort of well entrenched in the beef industry in Queensland. So I think that makes me well suited to sort of talk on this sort of topic for you all today. Now, just quickly, in terms of the focus of the Northern Australian Climate Program, our focus here is on climate variability, understanding the climate of a particular location, understanding what the variability is of that climate, but most importantly, providing that information in a timely way that allows landholders to manage for the variability that they might have in their particular location. So that is the main focus here, providing that understanding and that insight into an area's climate to allow landholders to manage accordingly. And we know on the land that just about every decision that we have to make will be influenced in some way or another by climate, whether that's pasture growth, water availability, whether we buy, sell, or reduce cattle or stock, where we might move or when we might move, weaner management, breeder management, whether we need to buy in feed, when or if we should burn, perhaps we're spraying weeds, we're looking to introduce pastures or legumes or leukemia into our system. All of these decisions will be impacted by either the climate conditions on the ground at any one time or what the conditions forecasted might be. And so hopefully, if we can provide you with the most accurate and up-to-date climate information, that will help you when it comes to making decisions about what's on the screen for you now or any of the other 1,000 decisions you make from day to day, month to month, and year to year on your property. So jumping into it now, that's the sort of precursors out the way, and now we can actually get into the content of the webinar. The season ahead, we'll look at the latest climate outlooks and insights for summer in Southwest Queensland. Just quickly, Southwest Queensland, it's a sort of broad term. In terms of where my footprint is and the landholders I look after, it's roughly sort of Roma west out to the Channel Country, at which time you've got another climate mate taking over that region, and more or less sort of south to the border. So running from Rome out to Charleville, Quilpie, sort of Eromanga, and down south from there, and back to St. George. That's the rough area in which I am producing forecasts for, or talking about the forecasts of, just to make sure we do have an understanding of when I'm saying Southwest Queensland. That's the rough area I'm talking about. Now, before we talk about any future forecasted conditions, really important that we get an understanding of where we're at now. What are the conditions on the ground today? Therefore, what will these forecasts mean in the context of the conditions that we currently have? Really quick, looking at the rainfall records we have. And if one of the questions you have, or if you're following along at home, is where do I find these particular maps? Please feel free to get in touch, and I can send you the links for all the information that I've got on the screens for you today. It's all publicly available. If we look at the last 3 months of rainfall, taking us up to the 30th of September across Queensland and Southwest Queensland, you can see for the Southwest, conditions are more or less average over the last 3 months. We're not above or significantly above or below average conditions for this time for the last 3 months of the year. If we bring that back to just looking at 2025 totals from the 1st of January right up to the 30th of September, the story looks a little bit more promising and favourable to southwest Queensland. We've actually got areas, particularly once you get west of Charleville, if you head further south, west of St George, we've got pretty good rainfall this year. And obviously we had that big rainfall event just prior to Easter that did cause issues at the time, but did bring a lot of rainfall to the area. And so for most of southwest Queensland and for most of Queensland, 2025 has been a year with above average rainfall and even the highest on record in certain parts. If we look at our 12-month rainfall forecast, so just looking that little bit further back, 1st of October to the 30th of September, again, a promising forecast for southwest Queensland, a very similar style map, and again, quite promising for Queensland as a whole, which comes on the back of a good year prior. So when we're looking at rainfall forecasts and we're looking at land condition and we're trying to get a sense of rainfall deficiencies or perhaps drought-like conditions, it's important not to look at just the 3 months or 9 months, but I like to pull it out to at least a 24-month rainfall record. And as you can see there, conditions are largely favourable. The exception being that sort of Roma down to Dunkeld, even across to sort of Morven region, which did seem to miss out on a lot of the promising conditions. So that's probably the exception to my claim that it's been a rather good 24-month period for southwest Queensland, with the exception of that St George to Roma stretch, which does seem to have missed out on the favourable conditions, but it's quite average for that area around there. So that would be the exception to the rule. We can even push out to 36 months, and again, a similar story there. Quite good conditions for the past 3 years. If we would look at rainfall deficiencies, this is essentially our drought map. We've got the 1st of January to 30th September, 2025 rainfall deficiencies. No concerns there at all for Queensland, and very limited concerns across Australia more broadly. We've even got a 20-month rainfall deficiency map for you there. The obvious concern is that's right on the southern coast of South Australia and Victoria and parts of Tasmania. But again, Queensland, unusually not suffering from any major rainfall deficiencies at the moment, which is important to recognise not only for your own patch, but to think about stock movements across the state more broadly. If we're looking at soil moisture for southwest Queensland, if you're right down on the southern border in the southwest, you've probably got above average soil moisture at the moment, but the general statement or the general takeaway for southwest Queensland would be that they're experiencing more or less average soil moisture conditions at the moment, which would be pretty low as we're sort of coming to the end of the drier season. Another map that we can look into here is our current total standing dry matter, or TSDM. Essentially, this is looking at how much feed do we have out on the ground right now, and it's a metric rather than kilos of dry matter per hectare or anything like that. It's a comparison to how much we usually have at this same time in the year across the years that we have data for, which is going back 70 years now. And we're looking at it from the 30th of September is the last data point we have for that. And green and blue on the map is obviously done visually because it suggests good conditions. And that's what we have across much of Queensland for this time of the year. Again, that big area in the southwest heading out to the Channel Country from that massive rainfall event we had in April, still seeing the benefits of that, still seeing good conditions down on the southern end of Queensland and even into the southeast, the Darling Downs and the Maranoa. We do have, again, though, that area around Roma, where we have the grey markings of average, but also a couple of yellow and red dots suggesting low pasture levels in those locations. But the main takeaway would be conditions for grazies in southwest Queensland when it comes to how much feed's in the paddock right now. It would generally be from average to extremely high for most of our locations in southwest Queensland. And by this time of the year, fire risk is always worth looking into when we're looking at our grass fire risk. And it doesn't take a genius to work out when we've got high levels of feed on the ground, we've got high fuel load with the dry conditions coming into the end of October, hot conditions, a lot of fuel, we're seeing that high fire grass risk. So it's probably the downside to the good seasons we've had at the moment is we end up with that higher fire risk across not only southwest Queensland, but across Queensland more broadly. Although it obviously lowers around that Roma region when we don't have that same pasture productivity or pasture growth than we did in other locations. So in less than 10 minutes just then, I think it took me 9 minutes, I flicked through probably 3 or 4 different tools to get a snapshot of not only where Southwest Queensland is sitting from a climate perspective in terms of its current conditions, but also Queensland more broadly. And we could summarize that really quickly. Recent rainfall, essentially average for all locations, neither above or below median conditions. 2025, mostly driven by that big rainfall event in April. We've seen above or above average rainfall, particularly the further west you went and almost getting into that Channel country became more and more favourable in terms of how far above the average that we were. 12 months, a similar story, slightly more favourable, above average or well above average for most areas. And then the 24 and 36-month rainfall conditions were above average for just about all locations, and particularly across most locations in Queensland. No major rainfall deficiencies. Rainfall deficiency is probably almost synonymous with drought conditions in these locations. None of those for Queensland. Soil moisture, no concerns there, either above average or average for most locations. More likely to be above average the further west or south you go. And then that total standing dry matter percentile by the 30th of September. East of Charleville, more likely to be average. South or west of Charleville, likely to be above average or well above average. So that is the conditions that we're experiencing at the moment in southwest Queensland. Now, let's have a look at what forecast we have moving forward for the season ahead. The big one that we hear so much about across Northern Australia, when I'm talking about Northern Australia, I'm talking about Queensland North, is ENSO, our El Nino Southern Oscillation Index outlook. ENSO is the major driver that we're looking at this time of the year. At the moment, we are experiencing neutral conditions for ENSO, although La Nina conditions may develop in the coming months. So our El Nino Southern Oscillation, referred to as ENSO a lot of the time, remains neutral. The latest relative index is negative 0.79. And as you can see from here, we need it to reach negative 0.8 and have sustained values at that level for at least 3 months generally to have that La Nina event indicated. So we're right at the tipping point, sort of sitting at 0.79 at the moment. The weeks leading up to that, we're below the 0.8. We're right at the point of teetering on La Nina type conditions. So if you're beginning to hear about that, that's the reason behind it. So some atmospheric indicators, trade winds, pressure, cloud patterns over the Central Pacific are showing signs of La Nina development. So we're certainly in that sort of state at the moment. What the predictions that we're seeing coming out of the Bureau, but also across other international models, is that for at least our Pacific Ocean temperatures, they're likely to meet La Nina conditions during spring and into early summer before returning to neutral conditions by the end of summer. So September to November, there is a high chance of La Nina conditions will develop, so around 55 to 60%. So a slightly better than 50-50 chance that we'll see La Nina conditions develop in late 2025 from September to November. From the October to December period, we're sort of seeing a higher percent likelihood of it coming in later in the year, there by sort of December. So a chance it'll come sort of towards the end of spring here, but a higher percent chance that it'll be upon us by December. Here's us looking into those Pacific Ocean sea surface temperatures, sometimes shortened to just be SST in our presentations or on the tools that we use. As you can see here, we're currently at neutral. So we're in October. The last data point I had here is this first green point. The last data point we had here was this black point. We're just beginning to have ourselves pushing into these La Nina thresholds. So over the next week or so, our sea surface temperatures might be exceeding those thresholds for La Nina conditions. It's possible that a La Nina may develop in the coming months. It is forecasted to be relatively weak. As you can see, we're not necessarily breaking right down across these thresholds and much down into sort of the La Nina categorization. We're just sort of crossing the threshold and remaining in that area for maybe 2 to 3 months. That's the forecast that we have at the moment. So perhaps relatively weak and perhaps short-lived in terms of the intensity of this temperature anomaly. And here's how that looks from a visual depiction. For those of you that have looked at ENSO before, when we have La Nina conditions, we end up with a cool body of water out in the Central Pacific and warmer builds up of water around Australia. That is your typical La Nina conditions. And that is the forecast for November to January for the upcoming summer period, is the sort of conditions they're expecting, which is a very sort of stereotypical La Nina, though perhaps not as intense as it can look in other situations, which I can show you. Here is a La Nina event where you see that massive buildup of cold water in the Central Pacific back to sort of towards South America. The exact inverse happens in El Nino conditions. We end up with a warm body of water out here and no real sort of warmer waters around Australia. If we were to look back at a year that everyone remembers, 2010, 2011, this is how this map looked over that period of time. And you can see that while we have that buildup of the cold water expected for the next 3 months, certainly not to the magnitude that we have had in previous years. So while we have La Nina type conditions expected and forecast and somewhat indicating themselves, perhaps not to the same extent as we've seen in other years that came with far more serious rainfall outcomes across much of the state. The other component of our ENSO outlook, we've got the sea surface temperature component. We've also got our Southern Oscillation Index component, which is a metric of pressure. At the moment, these values are sitting at neutral levels, and we generally look at these over 30, 60, 90-day intervals to sort of look for that consistent message of La Nina or El Nino conditions across 3 months. At the moment, all 3 of those periods are showing neutral states. It's certainly on the right side of the index, pushing up towards La Nina conditions, which would actually be on the top of the map in this situation. And while it has certainly got close to La Nina thresholds, it hasn't quite exceeded that. But at least we're above 0. We're tending towards those conditions. We would need above +7 to reach La Nina thresholds. And at the moment, we haven't quite got there yet. So while the Pacific Ocean sea surface temperatures are demonstrating La Nina threshold levels, we're not quite getting there with our SOI metrics at the moment. Now, for the next 15, 20 minutes, we're going to be looking at what really matters from the forecast that we have available and making sure that it's relevant to your area and your production systems. And the most important part of that is where and when these drivers are actually active. I'm only going to be looking at the 3 or 4 drivers that have a serious impact on rainfall and temperature across southwest Queensland for the coming months. I'm not going to get caught up on anything else. I want to keep it simple and I don't want to overcomplicate things. Now, La Nina years. When and where does La Nina have an impact for southwest Queensland? Well, if we look at winter and spring rainfall, in La Nina years, we generally get decile 8, 9, and 10. So we're in that top 80 to 100% of years when it comes to rainfall across winter and spring. That is the time at which we get the biggest benefit in southwest Queensland. The fact that we've only got about a month and a half left of those conditions is concerning, that we're not getting the full benefit that we might expect in La Nina years out of this. And that could be perhaps because of the intensity of this event and the fact we're only just meeting those La Nina thresholds. As you can see, it also has an impact on temperature. Winter, spring maximums tend to be below average. That's because we've got the higher rainfall typically associated with that. More cloud, more rain days means lower maximum temperatures. That same factor of having more cloud around does tend to mean we have higher minimum temperatures over that period of time throughout winter and spring. What happens over summer? A lot of people tend to consider La Nina, El Nino, those sorts of conditions to have a high impact on summer rainfall. That would be the case if you were up in North Queensland. I did live up in North Queensland, and they were always very interested in the ENSO outlook across summer. Surprisingly, though, for southwest Queensland, there's a big patch of southwest Queensland where a La Nina conditions have no impact on rainfall over summer. And then we have this greener sort of coloration, which suggests slightly favourable conditions when a La Nina event exists over summer across the rest of the state and much of northern Australia. But compared to our spring and summer rainfall maps, we have less of a beneficial impact of La Nina type conditions in southwest Queensland as we typically would in winter and spring. Similar story for summer temperatures as well. Another factor to consider that might not be as well known across Queensland and southwest Queensland is the impact of the Indian Ocean dipole. It is essentially the same concept in terms of where that warmer and cooler water is sitting in the Pacific Ocean. This is the mirror of that in the Indian Ocean. And it does have an impact on southwest Queensland. Not all of Queensland, but it certainly can have an effect on southwest Queensland. So the IOD is defined by the difference in sea surface temperatures between the eastern and western Pacific Indian Ocean, or tropical Indian Ocean, sorry. A positive phase brings drier than average conditions, and a negative phase brings wetter than average conditions. So in this situation, we want the negative values. A negative phase of the Indian Ocean dipole is currently underway. So we're currently within that. As you can see, the last black point. We are tending, while remaining negative for the next few months, we are tending towards neutral conditions. This is what we typically see with the IOD as the end of the year comes around. It returns to neutral conditions, although this should be favourable to us in southwest Queensland, that we will have favourable IOD conditions for the next 2, maybe even 3 months. Another thing in our favour as producers, perhaps in southwest Queensland, is the state of the Indian Ocean dipole. And if we're to look at that over the years, for our 9 negative IOD years since 1960, when we have a negative IOD corresponding with winter and spring, we get those favourable rainfall years where rainfall is above average, and from anywhere from the 7th percentile or decile, sorry, right up to the 10th decile. So again, a favourable condition state for us to be in, with conditions tending towards La Nina for at least a few months and a negative IOD corresponding with that at the same time. So we should see those climatic conditions and the state of our climate drivers reflected in promising rainfall forecasts, particularly for the month ahead, that last month of spring, where we get the most benefit from a negative IOD and the La Nina forecast, before we head into summer and lose a little bit of that benefit that perhaps our northern environments get an advantage from, that doesn't quite seem historically to bring the same benefits in terms of rainfall to our southern locations. Obviously, the first and most pressing issue will be people sitting at home going, John, I just want to know what we're getting next month in terms of rainfall. Well, our November forecast is promising. Again, the green and blue coloration on the map is always telling us that conditions are likely to be, and by I mean likely, there's a better than 50% chance that we will exceed median rainfall for our location in that period of time. And so we've got, broadly speaking, the light green through to the sort of lightish blue. They're saying sort of a 60 to 70% chance of exceeding median rainfall in southwest Queensland in November. The 60 to 70% chance of exceeding median rainfall does mean we've got a 30 to 40% chance that we won't. If you're a risk-averse grazier out there, I would recommend putting everything you see on this map into the inverse constantly. Don't even read out the 60 to 70% chance of getting more than your average rainfall. Only talk in terms of 30 to 40% chance we won't. That is a much easier way to do things if you're wanting to manage that risk that comes with a lot of these forecasts and not getting too excited or taken away, with the pretty green and blue colors on the map that tend to get us a little bit excited. Now, we don't have to just look at this chance of exceeding median rainfall. We can also look at how much rain we're hoping to actually receive. What I've clicked on here is because I like to get some certainty with my forecast. At the top of this screenshot, you will see that I've picked that rainfall totals that are getting shown on this map here are forecasted to have a 75% chance of occurring. So not a 50-50, we got a 75% chance of receiving these rainfall totals in November. So a high degree of confidence in getting this much rain. For most locations, if we're sort of talking west of Roma, right out to Charleville and even getting towards Quilpie there, anywhere from 25 to 50 mils is a 75% likelihood. Once we head out to the Channel Country or right down south to the border, that's looking more like 10 mils up to an inch. So certainly some rainfall on the way in November. The extent of that remains to be seen, but a high degree of confidence that an inch or more could be expected for most locations across southwest Queensland. We'll look at December as well, though. And now we're shifting into summer, where we in southwest Queensland don't get that same, or historically speaking, don't seem to get that same benefit of La Nina type conditions when it comes to our rainfall and how far above or below the average levels that we typically get. So, southwest Queensland, we've got a La Nina forecasted for December still, yet the benefit we're seeing in southwest Queensland is more or less a 50-50 chance of exceeding our average rainfall or our median rainfall. There's a little bit of green on the map, but there's also a little bit of red on the map. I generally just take this map as a 50-50 chance that our December rainfall will be above median levels. November, looking slightly favourable. December, essentially back to a toss of the coin for grazies in Queensland. What does that mean in terms of how much we might get? Again, we've got a 75% chance of occurring map on the screen there for you, and looking very similar to our November rainfall map. Essentially sort of saying November and December rainfall might look very similar in terms of the totals you end up with in the rain gauge by the end of the month. We've also got a 3-month rainfall map. And as you can see on the top there, there's other sort of time lengths for you to delve into should you wish and should you have the access to the internet. Our 3-month rainfall, our summer rainfall, December through to February, again, quite similar to our December map. It's looking very average. There's a bit of green on the map, not necessarily in the southwest Queensland zone. I'd be taking this as saying, again, a 50-50, if toss of the coin, for if you'll get more or less rainfall across summer, which does somewhat reflect the conditions that we usually get from a La Nina year, which is sometimes we get more over summer in southwest Queensland, sometimes we get less. No strong indication either way. Now, I don't put all my eggs in one basket when it comes to forecasts. I actually quite enjoy looking at other international agencies and what sort of conditions they're forecasting for Australia. The UK Met Office, UKMO, provides a forecast over this period as well for summer for Australia. And they're a lot more optimistic of our conditions, actually. They've got the chance of us getting more than our normal rainfall at 60 to 80%. So a far more optimistic forecast coming out of the UK Met Office for our location. We've also got another forecast available to us, the ECMWF forecast. This is the European Climate Weather Agency. And again, we're going here further out. For those of you that have been on this webinar before, you know that we like to look at the 1 to 3 month rainfall in the sort of medium term, but this long range forecast actually lets us look at the season in front of the one we're typically looking at. We're looking at summer today. We're focusing a lot on summer, but this is actually helping us look further out and closer to that sort of autumn period and seeing what's happening from the end of Feb through to Easter. And again, some favourable conditions being shown on the map for us. That light green and darker green coloration across most of Queensland, is suggesting favourable autumn conditions for southwest Queensland and much of our state more broadly. So while the BOM has a rather bland 50-50 type forecast for our summer period, international agencies are suggesting favourable summer and autumn conditions for southwest Queensland and Queensland more broadly. Now, something for you in southwest Queensland that wouldn't be relevant to anyone further north than yourselves is the southern annular mode, sometimes referred to as SAM. I might actually leave that for now. I'll leave that and I'll come back to it. It's popped up in the wrong spot. We'll go to temperature first. We'll look at our temperature outlooks for the month ahead. Now, remember, we had a favourable forecast when it came to rainfall for November, sort of saying 60 to 70% chance we get more rainfall than normal. So when we look at our maximum temperature outlook, we would expect, if we're using a little bit of our own logic, well, a bit more rain, a bit more cloud. We would hope to have some cooler days, and that is what is showing up with our temperature outlook. We're seeing essentially milder days, a lot of white on the map for southwest Queensland and Queensland more broadly. This is generally suggesting that we might have some rainier conditions across this month. Those rainier conditions, the increased cloud cover means we generally get warmer nights. And again, we've seen the red coloration get far darker in this minimum temperature outlook map, which is what we would expect to see given the rainfall forecast. So the temperature and rainfall forecasts are somewhat sending the same message to us for the November period. If we look at our December to February forecast for temperature, while we don't have a really red map, we do have a decent amount of red coloration, suggesting temperatures will be above average, although not getting any major indication of the hottest summer you've ever had. And so while there is red on the map, this isn't an intense signal for a really hot summer period in terms of maximum temperatures. On the other hand, our minimum temperatures, which can be critical when it comes to animal production, heat load stress, fertility, milk production, and a whole range of other aspects associated with animal performance, we are looking at warm nights. And so the December to February period, there's no mistaking this. If we jump back to our maximum temperature forecast, a lot of variations in our coloration from white all the way through to sort of a darker red. When it comes to minimum temperatures, it's quite a strong signal that we'll be having warm nights, even though the days might not be quite as warm as they have been historically for our region. We've got one more tool that I also like to look at. This is our pasture growth forecast for our locations for the 3 months from October to December. So that includes the 20 days we've had up until now, and then looks forward for another sort of month and a bit, 40 more days. And generally speaking, from the map, you're always going to have variations from top down to bottom in terms of the pasture growth outlook, but the dominant colour I see on the map for most locations in southwest Queensland is that red coloration, perhaps with a little bit of average conditions. So although we've got a historical benefit out of the conditions that we're somewhat seeing at the moment, that's not expected to flow through to our pasture growth, although that November rainfall might bring some production benefits with us come December, once that rainfall has had the ability to actually benefit the pasture growth aspects. So this October to December period hasn't quite demonstrated to us any major production benefits from a pasture growth perspective. So what's our season ahead looking like for southwest Queensland, given the main climate drivers we've assessed? What have their impacts been when it comes to our rainfall outlooks, and what can that mean for decision making? So we're currently in a neutral ENSO state, but we're tending toward La Nina, and there's a slightly better than 50% chance that we might get La Nina conditions over the next month, lasting up to around December, perhaps Christmas. So currently at neutral, right at La Nina thresholds, likely to develop in the coming month, as in a better than 50% chance, although we'll only slightly exceed these thresholds, and will only last from November through to late December, maybe early January. So a very short-lived La Nina event. So if you do hear talk about a La Nina getting called, I wouldn't necessarily expect us to see all the typical conditions we might expect to come out of a La Nina in other years that we've had. Our international friends are somewhat in agreement with us on that note in terms of when and where and how long the La Nina event will last for. The other component we have is the SOI index that we mentioned, all at neutral conditions at the moment, although they're closer to La Nina than they are to neutral in terms of thresholds. So we haven't quite reached La Nina thresholds with that either. The 30, 60, and 90-day values all at neutral, but we'll keep an eye on that over the coming weeks. If we look ahead, La Nina type conditions typically mean we get better winter and spring rainfall, we get lower max temps and higher minimum temperatures, and by summer we do see favorable conditions, but not to the same extent as we get over winter and spring. So our window for gaining the benefits from those La Nina type conditions is running out quickly, with November our last big chance for that. The negative IOD is something else that I mentioned. Most climate models indicate the IOD is likely to remain negative until at least December, before shifting back to a neutral state. When a negative IOD and La Nina occur together, they do have a tendency to bring higher than average rainfall to southwest Queensland, emphasising November is a really important month for us to get a good head start on the wet season and get the benefits out of the local or the climate conditions that we're seeing in that month. So November really looking like an important month for us to get the rainfall and get the benefits of these climate conditions. The rainfall forecast that we have, the BOM November, slightly favourable forecast. By December, back to a neutral forecast. When I say neutral, I'm saying a flip of a coin, 50-50 chance. That's what we're hearing as well from December to February, our summer period. The BOM's saying a 50-50 chance. Now, we're not seeing that same forecast coming through from the UK Met Office, which is predicting or forecasting a high likelihood of above median rainfall across southwest Queensland and most of Queensland across the summer period. And our European agency from February to April, that longer term forecast, is also quite promising in a 60 to 70% chance of exceeding median rainfall. So a little bit of a mixed story going on there. Temperature outlooks, November, max temps close to normal, min temps above average, pretty confident with that. And December to Feb, max temps above average, so there wasn't a really strong signal for it. And then mid temps had that really strong above average signal. So it looks like warm nights for the next 4 months. Although those daytime temperatures don't look to be too far above what we could expect for our locations in an average year. And the pasture outlooks, always there, always patchy, though were dominated by a bottom percentile for that October to December period. All in all, as far as forecasts go, there's no clear signal from these forecasts. The positive signs we are seeing in terms of the current and forecasted states of key climate drivers, our sea surface temperatures, our IOD, etc., are not necessarily showing up in our BOM rainfall forecasts or our pasture outlooks. The exception to that could probably be those November forecasts, which look slightly favourable for southwest Queensland. Temperature forecasts are generally what we would expect from a wetter growing season, a wetter summer period where we do get that increased rainfall. And we've got other international agencies that are far more optimistic about our rainfall prospects than the BOM. So that would be the thing that I would take away in 4 or 5 sentences. That's how I would summarize the month ahead as we round out spring and into summer for southwest Queensland. So while there might not be much clarity, and there might not be a high degree of confidence in the season being fantastic for producers or very poor, I think the information that we've got is still very valuable. Across none of the forecasts did we see any indication or any strong confidence of a very poor year when it comes to rainfall or for poor season. Conditions as a whole Taking the BOM look to be average, taking other forecasts look to be above average. And so I believe that would be a reasonable sort of range to expect for our season ahead. Perhaps a good start to our rainfall season with a strong November showing, and perhaps perhaps shifting back to more average type conditions from the BOM's perspective across summer. Although the UK Met Office with a far more optimistic idea of how things might go. And feeding that information that we've spoken about into our decision-making framework when it comes to this whole list and others that you have to consider and think about and mull over as producers in Southwest Queensland. Hopefully, the summary that I provided there for you today, when looking long-term at the seasons ahead, has value when it comes to calling the shots on some of these key decisions you might have to be making. Now, just quickly, because I like to look at the season ahead. So we're looking at summer and even the month of November. I also thought it'd be valuable to look at the near term. So the last 3 or 4 minutes here, just quickly looking at the near-term forecast. We're starting on the 23rd of October and running through to the 5th of November. So sort of the end of this week into the 5th of November, the 2-week period there. Again, we're seeing some benefit, as we would sometimes expect, with La Nina type conditions and a negative IOD. We would be hoping to get some benefit in October and November in Southwest Queensland. And again, a lot of green and blue on the map. So a good indication that conditions in the next 2 weeks might be above what we would normally receive for this time of the year. When it comes to how that looks, again, this time I've used a 50% chance of occurring. There's a chance of double-digit rainfall from Roma right out to Charleville before it sort of drops down again, sort of into that single-figure type rainfall. But certainly an indication that rainfall is around in the next fortnight. Now I'll talk about the southern annular mode, which is generally a shorter-term climate driver when we look at things. During summer, which is a I know we're not technically in summer, but we're close enough to sort of use this schematic. When we have a negative southern annular mode, it decreases the likelihood of rain for southern Queensland and northern New South Wales, as you can see on the map here, whereas a positive SAM typically increases this likelihood. Now, at the moment, we're coming out of a positive period into a negative period. So a negative SAM. So the index is at neutral at the moment as of the 11th of October, so about a week ago. It is forecast to dip briefly to negative values in the next week before returning to neutral conditions. So unfortunately, we've got a bit of a conflict between our rainfall forecast when it comes to the conditions of the IOD and our ENSO outlook. Although we've got this further climate driver that impacts more southern Australia that is dipping towards negative type conditions, which generally don't help us when it comes to rainfall. So a little bit of mixed messaging there in terms of the conditions and the drivers that are having an impact on Southwest Queensland, sort of getting pulled in opposite directions from our equatorial drivers versus our southern drivers. And the MJO forecast, just quickly to round things out. For those of you that don't know the MJO, the Madden-Julian Oscillation, it is a driver that's characterized by an eastward moving pulse of clouds and rainfall that travel around the equator every 30 to 60 days. It is very important for us over the summer period and those northern growing months, because they do affect rainfall. It does affect rainfall. It affects temperature, and it can also affect cyclone activity. A lot of the time, people see the MJO as an opportunity to kickstart the rainfall season in the north. And as you can see here, it does say that, especially in northern regions, often enhancing monsoonal rains and increasing the likelihood of tropical cyclones when active. So it can be a real kickstarter for our northern Australian wet seasons. And the map I have for you on the right here sort of tells us when we might expect to get the benefit because of the MJO, which comes in 8 different phases. For Southwest Queensland, the benefit likely comes in phase 5. If you're in North Queensland, you're very much looking for that phase 6 or 7 to get the benefit of the MJO in your particular location. Now, I know the MJO forecast looks like, your kids have gotten the crayons and started scribbling all over a map that you've left out. But we're starting here at the initial number, and we're essentially, given that we want to be in phase 5 to get a benefit in southwest Queensland, we're looking for when this line crosses into stage 5. And it's generally around that 28th of October date, which is somewhat corresponding with our favourable rainfall forecast over the coming fortnight. And so while the SAM, the Southern Annular Mode, is in a negative state, which isn't necessarily what we're hoping for, we do have an MJO forecast that is likely to enter phase 5 in the next fortnight. We've got La Nina conditions when it comes to Pacific Ocean sea surface temperatures that are at La Nina thresholds. We've got the negative IOD. We've got a few reasons to expect that the end of this month and into November might bring with it above average rainfall for our location. Now, if you have questions, I do encourage you to start throwing them into the chat. I did want to do a live demo, which is always the most stupid thing to do on a webinar, but I'm going to give it a crack. And so for anyone that wants to find some of the maps that I've looked at as part of this presentation, bom.gov.au/climate/outlooks will take you to this screen where I've got my temperature and rainfall maps. I just want to show you something quickly that I can't do for everyone's location, but it's really valuable for yourselves. Sorry. And if we were to look at that November forecast, we can click 1 month November. And I just wanted to show one live demo and a quick tip for people out there. You might be a grazier and you're out near Charleville and you think, I'm a bit south of Charleville. This is telling me that I've got a 60 to 65% chance of above median rainfall. Will it tell me more information than that? And I hope this works for me. Actually click where your location is. And you'll get a much more detailed insight than you get off this map. And here it is. I hope that's able to be seen by everyone. What it tells me now is actually a far more interesting breakdown of these rainfall maps. And it tells me my November period, and I'm near Baker's Bend, my chance of an unusually wet November, which would be above 71.5 mils of rain, is actually a 27% chance of that. So I've got more than a quarter chance, a 25% chance of above 70 mils of rain in November if I'm down at Baker's Bend. My chance of getting above 30 mils, which is the median rainfall, is up at 64%, almost a 2/3 chance of above 30 mils in November. And my chance of an unusually dry November, which would be below 13 mils, is right down at 14%. So I really encourage you to do some more research on this particular topic for your specific location when it comes to these insights. And you can jump across to the 3-month rainfall maps and get that same sort of insight for your location. It's far more insightful, far more valuable, and it gets us beyond looking simply at this above or below median threshold and actually gives us some real numbers for your location. So I strongly encourage you to do that. And if you hit any points at which you needed assistance, well, I would love to help you out. I'd love to get a call or a message or a text from you to help you work through some of these tools so that you become confident in using them yourselves, which is what we're trying to get to as part of this program. So thank you for attending. It's 12:55. After we did the introductions, we essentially, in the space of 45 minutes, were able to review what conditions we have on the ground at the moment. What does the last sort of 2 years look like in terms of rainfall? Where are we sitting right now in terms of being rain ready? And then looked at not only the month ahead, we looked at the summer ahead and even got an insight into the start of autumn, all in the space of about 40 minutes, which is, I think, the power of the Northern Australian Climate Program, is really simplifying this information and getting graziers to a position where they can look across a lot of different data sets and forecasts in a short amount of time, get all the information that's relevant for their particular location, and then go back about their day and make decisions that are coherent, given the information we have about what we could get forecast-wise for the months ahead. I'll pull up there. Happy to hear any questions or read any questions from the chat. And Aaron, if you'd had any questions that came in, perhaps as part of the pre-webinar process, more than happy to chat about those.
Thank you, John, for sharing your insights into the season and practical information for the season ahead. That brings us to the end of today's presentation and into the Q&A session. I actually have a few questions for you that I'll just quickly read out for you to answer. So you've mentioned warmer nights, and could you elaborate on how that affects animal performance in beef and sheep-based enterprises?
Well, the big thing that we've spoken about in the Northern Australian Climate Program is particularly around heat stress and heat load stress and the issues when it comes to warmer nighttime temperatures and the inability of livestock to return their body to normal temperatures. So they can deal with hot days, and they have to, obviously, in the Australian rangeland, so there's no doubt about that. What they need is those cooler nighttime temperatures in order to recover. So the body temperature goes up during the day, and hopefully, in a perfect world, it would return back to a normal temperature at some point overnight before the next day hits, and you continue on that sort of cycle. What happens when we have those really warm nighttime temperatures is we don't quite return back to that normal body temperature. And so we might be 0.5 degrees above where we want it to be by the time the temperatures start to kick in again for the next day. And if that happens for multiple days in a row, we actually have that body temperature rising and rising and rising, and we call that heat load stress. Now, the Northern Australian Climate Program actually did about a 3 or 4 part webinar series on that exact topic, and got into the science of it all, and I can certainly share links to that. And it's actually become one of the things where I am far more focused when it comes to animal health on nighttime temperatures than I am with daytime temperatures, particularly with breeders and breeding stock and milk production and fertility and calving and all the rest of it, that we now focus a lot more on what are those nighttime temperatures and minimum temperature forecasts, as opposed to getting too nervous about a couple of days in the 40s. So it's been, for myself at least, sort of a change in my mentality towards what hot conditions are, from, hot nighttime conditions can be just as bad as hot daytime conditions can be.
Yep. Thank you, John. And we are doing good for time. And so that's where we'll end our webinar today. And two key comments before you go. One is a reminder that this webinar finishes today, and you'll receive an email from myself with a link to a feedback form. Alternatively, the link is now available in the chat box if you'd like to complete it immediately. A few minutes of your valuable time to complete the feedback form is greatly appreciated and helps us to improve our webinars in the future. A big thank you to all of you for joining today's webinar. And a big thank you to John for providing us with some very useful information. Today's webinar was brought to you by NACP, Grazing Futures, and Leading Sheep. The Grazing Futures is funded by Australian Government's Future Drought Fund and Queensland Government's Drought and Climate Adaptation Program. And Leading Sheep is an important partnership between Queensland Department of Primary Industries, Australian Wool Innovation, and is supported by AgForce. Thank you again for joining us today, and until we connect again, it's all the best. Thank you and goodbye. Hope you have a great season ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.